So I want to talk to you tonight about privatisation and potential changes in public policy in the context of quite significant changes taking place with the outbreak of the COVID virus, the coronavirus. Now, many politicians and commentators have have noted that perhaps we're moving away from neoliberal times, times where markets reign supreme, and that perhaps the idea of coming back to balanced budgets and surpluses are a thing of the past, and people come first. And I want to perhaps question, of course, if that is going to be the case. So I think what we need to be aware of is the dangers that are already becoming evident in terms of the professed need for a snapback in the economy, the need to put a limit on, say, wage increases for public servants, the need to sell off public assets to reduce government debt. So I hope you don't mind me taking my camera off, but I think it's easier than seeing my ugly head online. So we'll just go with the slides if that's okay. So tonight what I want to do, as I said, is talk about the extent to which there's been discussion of a shift away from an economic paradigm, a philosophy, a policy framework that has supported privatisation over a period of time, and assess the extent to which that is likely to occur without support, without campaigning, without political engagement by activists such as you and me. So tonight what I want to look at is in terms of let me just move the slides along. Aha, good, getting there. Okay, so just as an overview, I just want to have a look at the so-called changing ideological times. There's some recent comments about the fact that perhaps, as I said, the commitment to a neoliberal framework, what we call neoliberal framework, has perhaps become less evident. But the extent to which what I described as zombie economics still is in existence. Then we'll have a look at what I was previously going to do before the COVID virus intervened, which was to look at the current context of privatisation in WA. And we'll just outline some of the mechanisms of privatisation so you're aware of the ways in which privatisation, as with the virus, has transformed over a period of time. It's morphed into different forms, and we need to be aware of these different forms. I'll put some background to these processes in terms of privatisation and neoliberalism in Australia. Then we'll have a look at the objectives of privatisation and assess them against actual reality. And then I just want to make some quick points about what are the forces that have promoted privatisation. Now, of course, these include, as I said, ideas, interests, and institutions. And although new ideas are emerging, we have to be aware of the interests that are very keen to ensure that things go back to the way they were. Or, as Scott Morrison talks about, the need to snap back to previous agendas, previous settings, if need be. And then I'll conclude with a brief few points about the need to fight privatisation and open up for discussion, although I realise that discussion is perhaps going to be a little bit limited given the technical capabilities we have. Okay, so let's move on then and have a look at the present context. So since the seminar was scheduled, the public discussion, the public headlines have changed quite dramatically about how the role of government should change or should be put into effect to deal with the COVID virus. So from an emphasis on small government, or at least the rhetoric of small government and the rhetoric of bringing the budget back to the black, getting rid of the deficit by 2029, there's been a renewed engagement with an idea that the government has a real role in terms of supporting the community and supporting both social and economic processes, to the extent that it upset many vested interests. So we see, for example, Okay. Give me a second, folks. Sorry.
So good. This is our first webinar, so I'm not surprised that but
Okay.
that's okay.
Hang on. Sorry. I just have to get the screens to move forwards. Okay. So already in March, we had discussions about the fact that the airline carriers, the major airline carriers, were in trouble, and economists were putting forward the idea that perhaps we need to nationalise at least Virgin. And this was already causing concern amongst the free marketeers, the conservative side of politics, and of course the major competition, Alan Joyce and Qantas, were coming out and saying that we really can't engage with these sorts of ideas of moving towards nationalisation. But then things moved on quite quickly with the job keepers subsidy, which was seen to be an important measure to stop the economic decline, although, of course, we already perhaps are aware of some of the major limitations of the JobKeeper subsidy in terms of who it covers. But at least on the right side of politics, there was originally people like Dennis Shanahan, the Australian, was saying that this big government engagement was to be justified. And then, of course, we came to a situation where childcare was announced to be free. Dan Tehan had, of course, said this was amounting to communism when it was mooted by the ALP previously, but this is now seen as possibly an all right feature to have in terms of the economic landscape during the COVID virus. It was important, but on behalf of the key backers of free market ideology and free market politics, to say that let's not take this too far. So we start to see in the headlines and the editorials of papers such as the Australian Financial Review a commitment to free market ideology. Still, things move along fast, and we see the national government bankrolling the private hospital system by $130 billion, and the states pulling the private hospitals into the public system. And increasing suggestions, I should say, that ideologies, the ideological divides that once seen before, were being thrown out the window in regard to the challenges of the COVID virus and respect for national interest. But in the last week, we've seen a clear statement by the government, by Scott Morrison, that in fact things won't change as much as people hope, that this perhaps isn't going to lead to what some feared on the right as socialism, and what some championed on the left as the end of small government's neoliberal policies. So there's the idea that the government would perhaps change its commitments to tax cuts, would change its overall economic agenda after the end of these special measures was made clear that this wouldn't take place. So we see that although there are some suggestions that there is a move to post-ideological times, we need to be concerned that the old positions about the roles of government, the extent to which the private sector should have more latitude in terms of providing public services, aren't necessarily going away. And this brings back the idea of to what extent do these economic ideas maintain a life of their own despite the rude intrusion of reality in terms of what's needed from governments to support both communities and economic processes. So this is the idea that despite rude intrusions into economic policy positions, the same commitments to these what has been described as zombie-like economic ideas continues. So it's almost 30 years since Michael Pusey wrote his influential text, Economic Rationalism, in Canberra, in which he noted that the country was enduring a locust strike of what he described as economic rationalism. And as a nation-changing state, a nation-building state, I should say, changed its mind. And he put this down to it being in the group of unfriendly ideas from Britain and the United States, here referencing Thatcherism and Reaganism, and what became manifestations of what was later known as neoliberalism, a doctrine that says markets and prices are the only reliable way to value anything, and that markets and money can always deliver better outcomes than states and bureaucracies. So these ideas were seen to change the economic fortunes of the state and of the nation as a whole. And we saw neoliberalism's advocacy of market primacy and reduced government involvement, consistent with neoclassical economic theory of a perfectly competitive market and the crowding out of private investment by government debt, changing the way in which the government's run. Now, these ideas had support, but of course, in post the global financial crisis, there was some suggestion that they had run their course. So following the global financial crisis over a decade ago, many argued that neoliberalism, which supports policies such as privatisation, was at an end and that it was dominant but dead, inasmuch as the associated practices, institutions and ideologies remained firmly in place, but it was bankrupt as a set of ideas. However, others have noted that economic principles of neoliberalism became zombie-like in both being dead and alive, and they continue to feed on and denigrate whatever they touched, transforming the practice of distinct areas into their own conditions. So we have Pusey there in 1991, John Quiggin writing about the fact that in economics and in public policy, these ideas that were dominant earlier and summed up with the phrase economic rationalism or neoliberalism were still in play. And we see even here in WA, this was evident. So back in 2009, for example, the Barnett government commissioned a report of the Economic Audit Committee, which put out a range of suggestions about how the public sector could be slimmed down and the delivery of public services could be better delivered through the not-for-profit sector. And I think that's important because it shows that these arguments, like viruses, like zombie creatures, mutate and transform over a period of time. So we have seen a transformation of some of the key ways in which economic rationalism, neoliberalism makes a claim about the downsizing of the public sector, but they trade at their essence. They stay true to the basic principles that were first put forward in the 1980s and 1990s, and we still see that today. So, award-winning economists like Paul Krugman talk again about, still arguing with zombies, the idea that this commitment to a particular economic framework is still evident. And so I think we need to be wary of that when we make any presumptions about a shift in the dominant policy framework in Australia and the way in which that might support or counter moves to privatisation. Okay, but in WA, out-and-out support for privatisation has seemed to be on the wane, and this is particularly since the election of the McGowan government. So the election of the McGowan government saw the Liberals in WA dump their plans to privatise Western Power. There was some suggestion, for example, that, however, that the government still had a policy that supported or at least countenanced forms of privatisation. So privatisation perhaps wasn't dead, but just that the headline processes of privatisation were being challenged. Some of those headline processes were the outsourcing of staff to Water Corp. So we see the government moving to bring back workers, 256 employees that were outsourced at Water Corp back into public employment. But we also see a shift towards privatisation, commercialisation and privatisation of Landgate. So things move on. While we're seeing both a general opposition to privatisation, we shouldn't see it as something that, even from a Labor government, is potentially dead and buried, to continue with that zombie analogy. Furthermore, we see suggestions that privatisation, forms of privatisation, can be supported in WA by what's called impact investing, social impact bonds, which I'll explain in a while. But WA was ripe for this new form of public-private engagement by which services could be delivered. And I believe Ben White was actually on the board of this process. Moving on, we see, again, a commitment to the privatisation of TAB. But swinging back, we see the government winding back privatisation of Fiona Stanley Hospital by again bringing back 650 jobs that had been outsourced. So we see swings and roundabouts here to some extent. We see jobs being brought back into the public service, privatisation wound back to some extent, but still assets being privatised, sold off. Now, in some cases, the argument for these sell-offs have been the use of these resources that are freed up for other worthwhile social endeavours. So the TAB, 65% of the sale of the TAB would go to a new women's hospital to replace King Eddie's, 35% to racing infrastructure, and the sale of Landgate, or the commercialisation and leasing of Landgate, would allow the government to address its national redress scheme for sexual abuse survivors. So there's an idea here that there has to be a playoff between different concerns, the use of money, and that's free from one area can be invested in another. So what we call asset recycling. Overall, but we do see the government, at least nominally, against privatisation, and this is in line with many other organisations in the Australian policy framework or policy milieu. So we've seen more recently the ACCC question the value of privatisation. Some large international backers such as the OECD and the IMF all coming out and saying privatisation has its limits. But the point I'm trying to make here is that privatisation takes many forms, and privatisation can be wound back in one area while supporting in the other. So we need to be wary of that and mindful of the ways in which privatisation can be explained and justified. So perhaps we should move ahead and talk about what we mean by privatisation. Many of you should be aware of what privatisation means. So this is a definition from the CPSU. They define privatisations as the transfer in whole or in part of public assets or public service provision from the state to an entity outside of the state, outside of the WA government. Now, this includes privatisation, asset sales to a private owner, private organisation, or the floating of the shares in a previously public entity, outsourcing that I've already talked about, in the way in which delivery of public services by a workforce employed by an external employer can be brought into place. We've increasingly seen new forms of privatisation come into being too, such as public-private partnerships and social impact bonds, although we haven't seen social impact bonds being supported or put into effect to the same extent here in WA. I guess the important thing about privatisation is that it's not just about the sale of assets or the transfer of services to the private sector. So with the TAB, we see a potential sale, but with Landgate, we're seeing a commercialisation and a lease of services. So it's not just the sale of assets, but it's more of a, as Dexter Whitfield notes, a comprehensive strategy for permanently restructuring the welfare state. And he says that this takes place, the transformation of the welfare state and public services primarily is in the interest of capital. And this aligns with what Jim Stanford said about privatisation last year for Unions WA, which is, I think, a really good definition, which is that privatisation essentially is finding ways to extract private profits from the provision of public's goods and services. Others would talk about this in terms of accumulation by dispossession, perhaps a highfalutin term, but the idea that capital is always on the private interests, the private enterprises, capital are always on the lookout for new areas in which to invest and make profits from. And public goods and services offer particularly valuable opportunities for new areas of profit making. Not all of them, but there's particular areas that are focused on. Okay, so let's move ahead then and have a look at the antecedents of privatisation, the background. So privatisation has become did become a central part of the playbook of policymakers in Australia in the 1980s and 1990s. It was seen as a way to roll back the mixed economy that had been in effect since the end of World War II in particular, that saw a balance between public-owned enterprises and private enterprise. And public-owned enterprises, particularly in areas of monopoly, such as electricity, telecommunications, etc., were all seen to be in the national interest and have supportable economic and social rationales for their existence. But we see in the 1970s a change taking place. This is around about the end of what's described as the long economic boom after World War II. The antecedents for these changes in Australia were first evident under the Whitlam government. So the tariff cuts in 1973, the anti-Keynesian budget was brought down by Bill Hayden in 75, all started to unwind the commitment to a mixed economy and a Keynesian model of economic policy planning. Reform and economic rationalism became the state logic from the early 1980s under the Labor and Conservative governments, and we saw a raft of privatisations taking place under the Hawke Labor government in the 1980s. Privatisation had become essentially normalised, and this set the scene for state governments to sell off assets in the 1990s. And Australia was a world leader in terms of privatisation during this period. So it emerged as one of the largest privatisers amongst liberal market economies relative to GDP. So we see a real commitment to privatisation, the notion that the extent of the state had to be limited, had to be withdrawn, and services and goods production was better undertaken by the private realm. There have been several professed objectives of privatisation. I think the most important one at the moment we need to bear in mind is debt reduction and the financial constraints of the state. So at the moment, there's been a huge outlay by both federal and state governments in respect to the COVID-19 crisis. I've gone through some of them at the federal level. At the state level, the WA Labor government has announced, for example, $640 million of support for the economy and the state in this current climate. So debt reduction and financial constraints are very important as a key argument for privatisation. Basically, it's the notion that the proceeds from privatisation are needed to eliminate government debt or to finance investment which the government can't fund due to other expenditure priorities. So they can't do this without incurring new debt or increasing taxation. And Morrison has already, at a national level, signalled that they're not prepared to increase taxation or enter into a new arrangement with a levy to address the COVID virus costs. As I've already pointed to, we see what's been described as arguments around asset recycling. The state has a limit on what it can invest in, and so it has to sell off certain assets, certain areas of the state in order to invest in new services, new operations. There's also arguments that privatisation brings about efficiency, effectiveness, and increased productivity, based on the idea that the government sector is, by definition, inefficient, and that productivity and efficiency can be gained through imitating the private sector through new public management. So aping the practices of management hierarchy that we see in the private sector and the public sector, or better yet, directly increasing the scope of private sector participation through asset sales and outsourcing. Now, sometimes it suggests that government ownership imposes unnecessary costs through political decisions and interference, and this impacts consumer prices. So consumers are affected, pay the cost of government interference. And by default, private ownership is not subject to these pressures and so more efficient, and lower prices will prevail. Now, I'll get back to these arguments in a minute, but as well as greater efficiency, there's also the argument that private ownership will allow for greater competition and consumer choice, and these will not only lead to lower prices, but better services as the public, as consumers benefit from innovation and that choice of service. As well as escaping the limitations of bureaucracy, the move, for example, as I said before, for public service into the not-for-profit sector is also sometimes suggested to be beneficial because it brings services to providers whose values more readily align with the interests of those that receive the services. So quite often it's seen that the public sector itself somehow is not as interested in providing innovative first-rate services, and that a closer connection with the recipients of the services, say through engagement of not-for-profit sector organisations, will be beneficial. And the last kind of point I'll pick up here is in terms of the objectives, is that it's quite often argued that retention of government-owned assets exposes governments to financial risks. And that's much better to allow the private sector to manage the allocation of investment, guided by the evaluation of risk and returns undertaken by investment banks and stock markets, with the assistance of rating agencies, etc. And this is claimed to be much superior to anything that can be undertaken by a government department, by the public sector itself. Now, already we've talked about the ways in which the GFC punched a hole in a lot of the claims that supported privatisation. But, you know, the outcome of the GFC, the global financial crisis, comprehensively challenges assumption that risk was better managed by the private sector. And we also see that in this case, the COVID-19 outbreak has once again brought about a failure of financial markets to anticipate the crisis and to provide any kind of risk management tools. Okay. So just quickly to respond to some of these claims, and once again, you're probably aware of this, but I'll run through them quickly. Government debt is not an emergency and has been small relative to both corporate and household debt. So we see the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe saying that we shouldn't be worried about the debt that's now been taken on. The Australian state, has a capacity to borrow, and the interest rates are as low as they've ever been, he said. So in many cases, we see interest rates well below inflation, so whatever that's borrowed at the moment will be of less value when it needs to be paid back. The budget accounts are in reasonable shape for a long period of time, and he says this is the time to borrow. Now, there is arguments here that borrowing government debt will require the state to confront some choices, This is according to the Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe. And this is how they repay that debt. Now, what's been suggested at the moment, one example is that the public sector should have a wage freeze so that it takes some of the pain, but there is important economic arguments against reducing the purchasing power of the public sector employees at a time when the economy itself is shrinking. If anything, this kind of what we described as the old times we kind of described as the treasury position. This is the idea that we have to shrink budgets down despite stagnating demand in the economy, will lead to a faster, sharper downturn in Australia overall. And as I've already pointed to, in terms of suggestions about making decisions, confronting choices, one way in which the debt could be serviced, as Professor John Quiggin points out, is by simply offsetting or suspending, cancelling even, I should say, the stage 3 tax cuts that have been legislated for the highest income earners in Australia in the 24-25 period. So these, within a short period of time, within a decade, these would help us pay off these debts. Already emerging is this idea too that the way in which government debt is conceived is not helpful. This is the idea that seeing the government debt is akin to household debt misrecognises the sovereign nature, the sovereign role of the state in terms of printing money and supporting debt. So we see this in terms of the role that the Reserve Bank has done in quantitative easing in Australia. So there has been emergence of what's been described as modern management theory and people putting forward these ideas. Whether or not this will get traction, we have to wait and see, given the forces that are still backing previous neoclassical conceptions of how the economy works. Another important point that I'll just quickly go through is that the idea of selling off a debt, or selling off, I should say, an asset, reduces the debt on the government's balance sheet. And it's pointed out by many people, including John Quiggin, Jim Stanford and others, this runs in the face of good bookkeeping and accounting standards. So assets that are recorded on the balance sheet of the state don't disappear in terms of privatisation. The debt doesn't disappear in terms of suddenly a change in the balance sheet. This is because whatever that asset is recorded as is a fair recognition of its value, and selling it will only bring in another asset, which is money. The only way in which this could lead to a benefit is assets potentially were on the books lower than what their true value is. So it's unlikely that privatisation of state assets would change government's balance sheets. Things that I've been more interested in my own research is the notion that private production is more efficient. Overall, we see that there's no justification that private production is more efficient. Private production is potentially cheaper if we cut jobs, and that quite often is the case with privatisation. We eliminate jobs or we introduce more insecure and precarious forms of employment. But managerial corporate structures tend to add to the costs through higher salaries of managers and remuneration packages for top management. And we see this even in the case where the not-for-profit sector has taken on public services, that the CEOs, the managers of the not-for-profit sector suddenly begin to be paid at a commensurate rate with the private sector. We also see other costs involved with marketing, advertising, etc. So waste and duplication in corporate structures. Of course, the notion that a private production leads to efficiency or cheaper outcomes for public is also undermined by the notion that private owners seek to maximise profits, and thus the public face higher consumer prices even in competitive markets. What we've also seen, particularly in public services, health services, social services, is the tendency for private operators to cherry pick those services that are seen to be most likely to return a profit. So engaging in activities that where the profit potential is higher, perhaps dealing with recipients of services that are less difficult or less costly to engage with, and leaving other areas to the public service, a depleted public service to take care of these much more difficult areas of service delivery. Finally, I'll just say here that privatisation doesn't eliminate public risks. Okay. So private firms supposedly take on the risk of financing and operating public facilities and services. But we've seen the way in which, say with the Fiona Stanley Hospital, the way in which major construction firms, I should say, have been unwilling to take on the cost of all these risks. And in reality, when firms collapse, if they do, the public sector cleans up the mess. So rather than shifting risk from the public sector to the private sector, privatisation shifts risks, costs, and responsibilities, in most cases, to individuals. So we've seen a case where rather than risk being shifted to the private sector, in the short term, risk quite often is shifted to, as I said, the communities or individuals in terms of access to services at the same level they had before. And increasingly, households are bearing the costs and risks associated with accommodation, health, transport, etc. Households, as we've seen with the current crisis, become the shock absorber of last resort. So we don't see privatisation moving that risk to the private sector, but the private sector looking for ways in which to offload that risk back to individuals. Okay. So overall, we've seen that some of the key claims about privatisation, the benefits of privatisation, haven't been borne out by historical experience. What are some of the reasons why privatisation continues? Well, Cahill and Toner, for example, in a recent book on privatisation in Australia, say the unreasonable persistence of neoliberalism and policies that support privatisation in Australia are the effect of powerful intellectual ideas, some of which I've already made reference to, and by the economic interests served by those ideas. Now, in terms of the economic ideas, I've already talked about neoliberalism as a set of principles that foreground the market as the key mechanism by which resources could be distributed throughout society. The key way in which choice and economic provisions could be provided. That makes sense. This rose to prominence in the 1970s and 80s at the end of the long boom, and many of you might already know this, but this was associated with the Montpellier Society. Hayek and Friedman all made arguments that the welfare state and Keynesianism was having real impact upon individual liberties, and they expressed concerns about the growing size of government and the welfare state. This original kind of normative critique of the welfare state and Keynesianism shifted in the 1950s away from individual freedoms and the impingement of individual freedoms to a more concern about economic efficiency and the way in which the private sector was seen to be much more efficient, much more effective in all things, even when there was monopolies, corporate monopolies in the private sector. This was seen to be preferable to publicly owned entities, publicly owned infrastructure, and publicly owned monopolies. So we see these ideas move in the 1970s from the extreme fringe to become centre stage in terms of public policy discussions. And neoclassical economics becomes orthodox during this time. The traditional counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policies became viewed by public policymakers as ineffectual and harmful, and government economic stimuli was seen to crowd out private expenditure. The control of inflation became central and at the forefront of all policy decisions. And the state became viewed, or state ownership, state provision of infrastructure and services became viewed, as I said previously, as inherently inefficient. Now, a related strain of theorising was public choice theory. So as well as neoclassical's commitment to a perfectly competitive market, public choice theory, put forward by people like Stigler, argued that voters, politicians and bureaucrats were alike driven by the same self-interested motivations that were seen to dominate regular economic behaviour. So they were seen to be driven by the same sort of economic concerns that dominated in the private sector. And public service ethos was just a fig leaf by which those in the public sector amassed their own private reward. So it was self-interest that politicians and bureaucrats produced contradictory outcomes, or contrary outcomes, I should say, compared to that same self-interest in the private sector. So we see these basic ideas of the inefficiency of the public sector and the beneficial extension of market relations become dominant. In terms of institutions, during the 1980s, these ideas became embedded in Australia and elsewhere through institution organisational change. So in the Australian public service, the rules of conduct, constraints and recruitment processes all favoured those that aligned with these sorts of values. And we saw particular departments in the state, such as the Treasury, become more dominant in terms of policy settings and influence across the public sector as a whole. And we see new institutions such as COAG and the Privatisation Commission put into place to support these ideas. Now, in and of itself, these ideas, as I said, can't be used to explain the dominance of neoliberalism or the continuing commitment to things such as privatisation. So the coherence, the cogency of these ideas in and of themselves don't explain the continuing existence of these policy frameworks, these commitments to privatisation. But instead, as a materialist, I would say we need to look at the interests. And of course, as we said before, privatisation opens up public sector to profit-making opportunities for the private sector. And so we see private businesses engage in lobbying to have access to the provision of public sectors. We see a massive transfer of wealth through privatisation from the public sector to the private sector. Private sector organisations supported many of the think tanks that proselytised the notions of small government and neoclassical economics that supported privatisation. They condensed complex intellectual arguments into potent rhetoric aimed at shifting the public debate. Much of the interest in privatising the public sector was to reduce labour costs and to introduce new labour control mechanisms more akin to the private sector. Labour practices, labour standards akin to the private sector. And in particular, there was a focus on undermining the strength of public sector unions. The public sector was, and particularly in utilities, was a key bastion of public sector union strength, and privatisation allowed governments to take this on. And this is the case even with Labor governments. As well as direct production, there's also interest in terms of the way in which privatisation opens up opportunities for finance capital. This is not only banks and financial institutions that support the buyout of public assets, support social impact bonds, and support those sales, but also the way in which major consulting, accounting, and law firms started to become involved and attract large fees for supporting privatisation measures and supporting new models of public-private partnership, social impact bonds, etc. And finally, in terms of interests, we do see as well politicians and senior bureaucrats become rewarded. They either join advisory boards or board positions once the public sector is privatised, or indeed once the public sector is transformed through new public management, that is, once it apes the practices of the private sector in terms of managerial practices and managerial hierarchies, we see senior managers paid a lot more. So there is interest there. A classic example would be someone like, Gary Sturgis, who worked for Nick Greiner and supported his ideas in terms of, or supported his agenda in terms of privatisation, and then went to work for Serco years later, and then in terms of their think tank about privatisations and contracting out. So we see politicians and senior bureaucrats supported there. So just to conclude, I'd say that we've seen that privatisation doesn't provide the benefits once put forward. Indeed, it has had perverse economic and social consequences for Australian society. But it has continued on. We shouldn't underestimate the degree to which privatisation agendas in different forms are likely to continue on. But I do think that the COVID crisis is an opportunity for activists to highlight the need for a strong public sector and to rally against any increased shift towards privatisation. So, for example, the virus has laid bare how internationally public health systems have been weakened by neoliberal budget cuts and privatisation. And just to give you one quick example to conclude with, if we look here in terms of in Europe, the way in which privatisation, new public management has brought about a two-tiered system in the area of health. So a two-tiered system not only through, as I said, privatisation, increasing presence of for-profit players, but also in terms of the corporatisation of new public management, public hospitals. One of the impacts of this has been the shift away from earlier commitment to services for all, and in more specific concrete terms, a reduction in the number of public beds available. So we've seen a shift through privatisation, through cost cutting, and a reduction of services, and this is quite conspicuous in terms of public beds. Now, in the present circumstances, public beds are critical for people in terms of getting the health care that they need. If we look here at this chart of the beds per thousand of the population, we see from the 1990s until 2015 a reduction across a number of countries in terms of beds available, both public and private. And what I think is interesting, just to finish on, is the way in which we look at Germany. The number of public beds haven't declined as quickly as some other countries, such as France. And if we compare the outcomes in terms of deaths from the COVID virus between France and Germany, they have similar rates of infection, but Germany has a quarter of the number of deaths. Now, there's reasons behind this, including the fact that they got out quicker in terms of testing. They've had more strict social isolation, but at least part of the story is the high level of hospital beds available in Germany, in the way in which privatisation hasn't affected that country as much as others. So overall, I'd say that to support Whitfield's claim here, Whitfield argues that marketisation and privatisation provides new opportunities for accumulation, new opportunities for profit making from the private sector, but it also allows capital to gain more power and control in the economy overall. It limits the scope for democratic provision of public services. And importantly, in a time such as this, we should be mindful of the way in which privatisation transfers risk, cost, and responsibility to individuals. So we need to be aware at this point in time that of the way in which public policy might respond to the new economic conditions. And we need to be wary of this never waste a good crisis perspective, which will see the new debt levels coming out from government policies at the moment used to justify future privatisations, used to justify future shifts that reduce the scope of the public sector even further, all in the aims of supposedly allowing the economy to snap back. So privatisation and austerity need to be opposed, and we need to have widespread commitment to public services. Okay, garbled, but I'll leave it there.